All right, so we are live. Good morning, folks. If you're watching, looks like we have two two people,
Us.
probably. All right, so it's an unusual stream because it's happening on a Monday, but I am here this morning with John, the old geek. And we're going to talk some Call of Cthulhu. If I said I'm a little on the weird side this morning, I am just not awake. So let's see how this goes. All right, so I guess we'll maybe give it a little bit to see if anybody shows up before we dive in. That way people aren't having to backtrack too much. But if you're here and watching, sound off. I can see there are two of you. Oh, there's a mages in the wings. Let me let him in as well. Hello, good morning, sir.
Hello, John. Fancy meeting you this neck of the woods.
Yeah.
But all right, so yeah, it's an off day. It's a weekday. I'm not exactly sure what the head count's going to be for viewing, but we can always just dive right into this. If folks come in, they can sound off. But today's topic is going to be Call of Cthulhu, specifically the Call of Cthulhu RPG. And I had a couple of things, kind of an outline on this, and I wanted to sort of start with, because I think John and I have similar experiences with the game where like we didn't get into it as early as we could have, maybe because of some of the crap we heard about the game. And I know that was my experience, but I want to kind of start with that and then talk about like how we came into the game, and then also the game itself, experiences playing the game, troubles you've had playing the game, like any issues you had playing the game, and then go on to like just a final chat and kind of post amble there. I guess I will kick it off. Looks like we have our RW Bishop here. So for me, Call of Cthulhu is one of those games that I wish I would have played a lot more of in my life, and I didn't start playing because every time I talked to somebody about it, all I ever heard about was how deadly it was or how everybody goes insane. And it sounded like just such a one-dimensional game, kind of like what you hear about with people when people want to talk poorly about older D&D, for example. They're, it's nothing but combat. And so for years, I passed it up as just that horror game that, sadomasochists play, because either you're playing because you enjoy getting killed and having your character go mad, or you set out to do that. And when I finally played it, I was just like so regretful of so many decades missed playing the game, because I really enjoy it. I came into it with 7th edition, so that's how long it took me to get into it. But yeah, I mean, those early experiences of coming in and talking to somebody, and they're like, "Oh yeah, it's that really cool game where everybody goes insane and where everybody dies." I'm like, "Yay!" And then you find out that not only is the game not written that way, not only is the product range not written and designed with that expectation, because you have massive campaigns like Masks of Nyarlathotep and stuff like that, and Terror on the Orient Express and all of that. And so clearly the game is written for some long play in mind. And even then, Sandy Peterson, in the age of the internet, we can hear him himself talk about his intentions for the game, and him and Mike Mason and what they thought about the game. And they don't say that. So it was such a missed opportunity. John, how'd you get into the game?
Well, I originally played role-playing games back from about 1983 to 1992, and in that time, almost everything we played was D&D, because we didn't have a lot of time to play role-playing games. We didn't have a lot of funds, and I'd heard that this game called Call of Cthulhu existed, and I knew nothing about it. I'd heard people say, "This game is really good. This game's really good. Give it a try," but it never happened. It just never happened. So when I came back into gaming about 2012, and somebody said, one of the guys in one of the groups I was in at the time said, "Oh, how do you fancy playing some Call of Cthulhu? I'll run a game." I was like, "That's that game I heard about 25 years ago. Yeah, I'll play." It sounded fun. To me, it sounded fun. I liked the idea of playing in a horror game in a slightly more a slightly more modern set, a 20th century setting I could easily relate to, and played it. Absolutely loved it. Absolutely loved it. See, I had heard it was lethal and all that, and in that session it was a one shot, and I think I was the only character who survived. And I survived because I failed a sanity check, which caused me to run away. But everybody else got devoured by the thing. But my character
lethal. It's easy. I lived.
Yeah, but I mean, my running away had been involuntary. It was just a case of fail a sanity check. You get the result of you run like mad. So I ran and I jumped in our car and I drove off, leaving everyone else in the group to get consumed by some big globular mass that was coming towards them. Oh well, what a shame. Loved every minute of it. Loved it ever since.
That's cool.
As simple as that.
Sean, what about you?
I am a 100% Call of Cthulhu noob. I have played some total of 2 games, both of them run by John. However, that said, when I was a kid, I was into Palladium's knockoff version, Beyond the Supernatural.
Yeah.
That was one of my favorites, even though I was 14 and didn't know how to run it correctly. But then, what could I do correctly at 14? So I always loved Beyond the Supernatural, and at 14, I was familiar with Tolkien, but I had never heard of Lovecraft. No, sorry, I'd heard of Lovecraft, never read Lovecraft, and I'd never even heard of Call of Cthulhu as a game. So it was completely out of my radar. But Beyond the Supernatural, it's the same idea: supernatural, paranormal investigators. And I always loved the genre. That was sort of my introduction to that. The role-playing version of that genre. I probably would have gotten into Call of Cthulhu in the 80s had I known about it. So,
yeah, I did play I did play earlier games, or not earlier games. You can't really say earlier than Call of Cthulhu, but I did play other games. I played Chill, and I did play Beyond the Supernatural. And I just, when I played those games, they were fun. We had a lot of good times. But talk about how negative word of mouth, or just presenting a game so shallowly can turn somebody off.
Your experience was mine. Like, when I did learn about Call of Cthulhu, everybody I knew who played it is like, oh yeah, it's deadly and you go insane. And those are the 2 key talking points.
Oh yeah, and I hadn't read Lovecraft. I didn't read Lovecraft until I was an adult, like in my 30s. I think I'd known his influences, and I'd known about him through like Deities and Demigods, and because I had the original Deities and Demigods with those myths in it, and I knew what Call of Cthulhu was and stuff, but I hadn't read any actual Lovecraft. So it's not like I had a pull from the source material to guide me towards the game or to refute anything that was being said about the game. Not to mention, source material versus game is not always a 1-to-1. So let's see, RJ Bishop here. I was just talking about a campaign he's working on. Cool. So that was our how to get into the game.
He has asked a question there. Any advice in constructing a workable module? That's quite a difficult one for me to answer, because I'm in the process of creating my own Call of Cthulhu adventure for the first time ever. I've always run pre-produced stuff up until now, and I may be able to answer this question in a month or 2. But what I've basically done is I've got an idea in my head. I found some really authentic looking maps online with suitable place names. So I'm going to adapt my idea for this particular location. I've got a little roster of names and some ideas of their personalities drawn up, and I've got 3 or 4 ideas for events to happen. I haven't actually put it all together yet, haven't pieced it together in terms of clues and an end solution and all of that. I don't have that worked out yet. But I think working from the ground up and leaving gaps, I think, is the key, and be willing to improvise in those gaps.
Drip feed information like any history. Yeah,
I can speak to that too, because like everything else, I'm a homebrew guy. I came into Call of Cthulhu as a keeper, not as a player. I brought it to my gaming group, and so. I can say that what I usually do is I start I have a Google Drive folder full of ideas, scenario ideas, and then for my scenarios, and a lot of times it's just as an idea comes to me, I'll write it down. But once I have a scenario that I'm going to flesh out, I will go through and list key NPCs, the ones that are involved. Well, actually, let me back up. I'll start with like what is the issue, just like a brief synopsis. There's an old house on a hill. It's got a monster in the basement. The man who lives there is keeping the monster secret. And then I'll figure out like a problem that comes from that. And then I'll write in characters that NPCs that cross some of those axes, whether it's like people who know the old man, source of information. And then I'll put down like a bullet point list of information that can be found out. And I find that that's all I really need to play a scenario, because the players themselves will wander widely. And then, if you know who in town has the information and what information there is to get, where it is to be found, then you don't have to worry about it being railroady, because your players don't go talk to the sheriff who's been out to that house a few times for strange noise complaints. Okay, but maybe another person in there is, one of your NPCs, or even tangentially to the sheriff, could be, your diner waitress who has heard the sheriff talking to a guy about the sounds up at the old house on the hill, using the, so a really brief outline is with key points is the most useful to me. Having a good grasp of what your thing is, what your synopsis is, what your problem is, what that is will allow you to flex on everything. Because Call of Cthulhu is one of those things that doesn't really require massive amounts of work with stat blocks and stuff. Most often the only stat block I have is maybe for the thing that the players might come up against, or if there is an active antagonist in the scenario, cultists, mobsters, native tribesmen, ghouls, whatever. I'll have those involved. I'll have those stats written up, and usually just pulled from another product I have a PDF of, and just cut and paste, right? But most people are going to have average stats, and what the Call of Cthulhu average is. If you're playing if you read the rules, it'll give you the averages. You can just go from there. If they're an exceptional, if they're a teacher, fine, give them a high education, but you can just wing it. Yeah,
of course you can. Of course you can. I mean, if they decide to beat up a beggar on the street, he's going to have about a 30 brawl skill. There you go.
Yeah, I mean, unless he's some horrible monster in disguise, and
well, it can be, yeah, of course.
But no, I would say don't. I find that the best scenarios I've run for Call of Cthulhu in the realm of homebrew, which is everything I do, have been the ones where I haven't overthought it, and I've really kept it bare minimum, because they flex really easy. If you're doing something a little bit more involved, like a campaign, then obviously more work. I mean, you're not going to be able to wing something like, Masks of Nyarlathotep. I mean, if you can, you're an amazing genius, and I mean, your players might never know the difference. But for a one-off scenario, I mean, it's literally, like I said, creepy house on the hill, old man takes care of it, keeps people away. Who in town knows what about what other clues can be acquired besides information from people? Are there newspaper articles? And this is where a lot of the work will come in. There are websites you can go to make fake prop newspaper articles. Yeah. I spend time looking at antiqued photos and stuff. Like for one scenario, I had them find a packet of photos from World War II showing a German expedition, and I literally found a bunch of pictures of a bunch of Gebirgsjäger wherever, and from various deployments, and each picture I would attach written on the back is a little caption, and that showed like, here's some guys smiling, here's some guys having fun, here's some guys eating, here's some guy curled in a ball looking terrified in a hollow in the ground, and here's a big old tooth with a ruler next to it. you know, and that was actually something I found, which is really cool, is that somebody had found some big old fossil tooth, and had a ruler next to it, and I'm like, cool. And so they, they're going through and they're looking, my players are looking through the props, and that was the last photo, and they're like, oh, so there's something with big teeth in this scenario.
Yes.
But yeah, your props can go a long way. Maps, like you mentioned with maps. But yeah, I hope.
Yeah, I mean, I found a website that got historical maps of the British Isles, and I just zoomed in on bits and pieces that I thought that might be interesting until I found what I thought would be the perfect location for the scenario I've got in my head.
Oh yeah, and thanks to the internet, floor plans for houses and stuff are abundant. Especially for 1920s and stuff like that. The Sears catalog had lots of prefab houses you could order, but also you can find floor plans and stuff for just Art Deco, 1920s, 30s, LA, mini mansion, boom, and you'll have a floor plan. Not even a gaming floor plan, like an actual just like out of a catalog kind of a thing. So.
I mean, take anything I say about developing Call of Cthulhu with a grain of salt, because I hadn't played a lot of it. But yeah, I would start from the work backwards, think like a mystery. Okay, what is going on? What's the scenario? But like any game, don't force the players down specific beats, right? Just if there are going to be events happening, let them just happen on their own time. Create that slow burn drip feed of information to build that mystery. No different than sort of writing a Lovecraftian story, I guess.
Actually, you make a good point there, because a lot of the published adventures I've read do have a timeline of events as one of their inclusions. This is when things started. This is where the players come in, and this is when things will happen, regardless of
what the players do.
Yeah, and a lot of times those events, especially if you've got active participants, if there's a ritual or a cult going on or something like that with a timetable, it is in your best interest to have that timeline. I mean, if you're just doing one of those investigations where there's an old city somewhere and something's in it, well, then your timeline really isn't all that important.
Right. That's an exploration. It's almost a D&D excavation. Yeah,
exactly. So yeah, that was a good question. Let's see, but and that kind of then goes sort of, I guess, into our experiences with the game. So, Sean, you haven't had much. You've already said that, but and John, since you started playing though, like how? I mean, tell us what have you run mostly published stuff?
Yeah, I mean the first game I played, I learned afterwards it was a published adventure. I now own that adventure, and I've since run it myself. And a couple of people in that group ran a few adventures, and I'd been bitten by the bug. So I went to my old Friday group and I got a copy of The Haunting. I'd got no Call of Cthulhu rules. I hadn't got any of the rule books. I just knew it was skill based. I downloaded some character sheets. I knew how the basic mechanics worked from having played in 2 or 3 sessions, and I ran The Haunting for them, and it worked. And that just shows how simple the system is at its basic core. It wasn't the greatest display of being a keeper, I have to admit, because I was just doing it heavily improvised on a whim, pretty much. But since then, I've bought quite a lot. I've obviously bought a full set of rule books. I've got 6th edition. The first game I played was 6th edition. I bought the 7th edition rules. I've played in Cthulhu Masters tournament 4 times at the UK Games Expo. Some excellent groups, really, really good GMs. I've got that box set of reproduced 2nd edition stuff, and a load of the big campaigns. And most of what I've done up until now has been running either one-shots or the big campaigns. And I tend to veer more towards the one-shots because we tend to have Call of Cthulhu as something that we have used to have a change of pace.
Yeah.
I would dearly love to get back into running Horror on the Orient Express, for example, because I've run the first third of that campaign, but COVID put paid to that, unfortunately. And I've only just now come to getting to the point where I've got the confidence, I think, to create my own adventure, because up until last year, I'd never read any Lovecraft. I've still not read any. I've listened to 4 or 5 books on audiobooks.
Yeah.
So I've taken them in, but I've not read them.
I've got to that point where I'm starting to mostly listen now and starting to venture out into the Lovecraft adjacent works myself, where I'm finding a lot of really interesting stuff. I was listening to one last night, actually, and I'm like, is this the origin of the name for a Sararak? Because there's a character in there whose name is Azer. It's almost a Sararak, but different consonants.
Azathoth. Maybe.
No. It's almost a Sararak, and I was like, wow, because the guys who created the games way back then
We're heavy readers.
We're heavy readers, and I'm like, because he's like a Zetarak or something like that is the name of this wizard, of this
Ace-Eric.
Yeah, exactly. His name I think his name was a Zetarak or something like that. And I'm like, huh. But no, it's that's the one thing I there's so much work out there that Lovecraft himself didn't write. Also, there's a whole bunch of stuff that he ghost wrote that you can find too. Like one that's really interesting is the Mound, and that was fun because he was contracted, can't remember her name, by this lady to basically ghost write this work, and she gave him a scrap of paper with there is a mound, and on top of it there's a mound, and on that mound is a ghost, is all she gave him. And to write this thing, and he didn't like it. So by the time he is done, we've got a man transported to an ancient land with strange people and beasts and degenerate, downfallen civilization, blah blah blah. Oh, and in the end, the ghost that on the mound is this woman who helped the dude escape and therefore was punished by having to stand out there as a beacon. It's like,
that's awesome.
Yeah, exactly. But it's clearly he was like, I have no idea what to do with this prompt you gave me, but I'll write something and then I'll tack it on at the end. But no, it's the Mound is a good one. There's evidently a really cool new series that talks about what happened to the people of Innsmouth after the government came in. So kind of an interesting one. They actually
I've not seen that, but yeah, that sounds like it could be interesting.
They get sent to concentration camps, which is what they say in the original Innsmouth story. But then the author dovetails it into the American Japanese concentration camps of World War II era, and kind of dovetails the stories together. It's interesting. So basically the Japanese start coming to these camps that were originally made for deep ones. And then what happens when those two cultures kind of combine. But
why are there so many pawns in this concentration camp?
Well, it's interesting because evidently in the story the problem is that the deep ones started dying off in these camps because they could never get back to the ocean because they were having the Innsmouth people mature well away from, in the California desert, where these camps were. And
no doubt by design.
Yeah, but no, it's just interesting. I've not read the whole thing. I heard an interview with the author, and then I've read some synopsis and stuff. So there's a lot of stuff out there. But yeah,
I have an ice cream van out on my street.
I was
going to say, could you go out and get me a cone? You might have to put it in the freezer until I can visit England, but I'll take a chocolate swirl.
There you go. Never go back and try your favorite ice creams from your childhood, because you will find that they are all much smaller than you remember them, and
everything's much smaller than I remember it, apart from my belly.
Yeah.
So yeah, but yeah, I mean, for me, I've run like mostly the homebrew stuff. I have a lot of fun creating and weaving weird stories. I don't, although I have to admit, sometimes I'm wondering like, am I actually running the game right? Because I haven't run published stuff much, and I've read through it and stuff, but I do have those like imposter syndrome moments where I'm like, you know, am I really running this game the way it was intended? Am I really capturing the Lovecraftian vibe?
I don't know if I am. That's the thing. I mean, the two scenarios I ran for Sean. One of the scenarios, to be honest, wasn't that great, but we still had fun.
The vault scenario, yeah.
The vault one, yeah. It was still fun. It was just a bit too forced at times. But the other one, the Forget Me Not one, I think I did a decent job of that. People seem to enjoy it, and it was suitably disgusting, and it was. Sean will attest to that.
Well, and part of the problem, I think, honestly, is that Lovecraft's own work really isn't. What you see in the RPGs is not representative of the vast majority of Lovecraftian literature. There are only a couple of stories that come to my mind that are the actual templates for the RPG. One of which would be the Dunwich Horror.
Because his work's not visceral at all. He leaves out a lot of physical description.
Well, it's not even that. It's just the nature of like a group of people investigating and dealing with the horrors.
Paranormal, yeah.
It is not represented all that often in his books. So many of his stories are tales that are told after the fact. They're chance encounters, third party, tellings. But like the Dunwich Horror, for example, or Dunwich Horror, I've heard it pronounced different ways, but is an actual group of academics from a university show up to deal with the thing in Dunwich. They have special gizmos and a spell and special ammunition for their shotgun, and
there's the basis of the game, but whereas everything else is just
another one would be
tales.
Horror and Red Hook, I think, but that's like a cop. It's basically a cop story, detective story written by Lovecraft in a Lovecraftian sense. It's this kind of broken detective who goes down to a bad part of town and deals with it. But
interesting thing. I mean, obviously Dunwich, it's based on a village in southeast England. There is a village on the southeast England coast called Dunwich, which is that is a pronunciation, Dunwich. It's not Dunwich.
Yeah.
It is Dunwich.
Dunwich itself, the way he wrote it, is much more representative of some of the backwater New England towns. The town name is probably taken from the.
I would say if most of English Dunwich existed, it would be very much a backwater. It's just it's got a very interesting history, and that's probably why he's picked on it.
If Lovecraft, maybe, I don't know. I mean, Lovecraft wasn't exactly famous for traveling and experiencing, but he read a lot. So, and he was very judgmental of anybody who wasn't polite New England society. So, with Dunwich Horror, Dunwich Horror, that's where you actually see the role playing game framed out. In my mind, everything else is kind of weird one-offs, and a lot of it is not even actual activities taking place. It's a description of something that happened, and so finding where your games, especially if you're writing them yourself, are supposed to interface with the mythos can often be the hardest part for me. It's like otherwise it ends up feeling kind of contrived and canned, and I guess in a way it's supposed to be because horror movies are, but horror is.
You're creating that story that, in theory, will be retold in the future by some twisted survivor, if there is a survivor.
Yeah, I feel like a lot of times, actually, one thing that bugs me and that started bothering me too is like so many of the stories that you read, so much of the fiction you read is people experiencing it when they're not expecting to experience anything. And that is such a hard thing to capture at a tabletop game. Unless you're doing like a one shot with characters,
You could probably try to manufacture that with a little misdirection. Let them think they're investigating one thing, and then something completely out of left field is the real crux of the story.
Yeah.
Still...
I've done that once so far, and that's where they were on their way to some place and they had to take a side trip, and the side trip ended up being the actual adventure. They were like,
right.
we need to go from. They were trying to get to Boston, and they had to get off their train, and they had to take a truck through the backcountry, and that's when things happened. So
yeah. But you're still, as you say, there's still only going to be a limitation of that, because people sitting down to play a game are going to be expecting something to happen.
Of course, yeah.
Yeah, I think the best you can do is, like you're saying, you can misdirect them, because you can set them up to know they know that something's going to happen. But I think you kind of a good way, and a lot of the scenarios are written this way. The written scenarios where you're there for a purpose, and then something else happens. Like, we're here for the reading of a will.
I would even go so far as to let them think they're on a mission, right? Let them think they're on one mission. And so, this is what we're here to do. We're here to find the vampire in X small town. And then said vampire turns out to be nothing. And then something else that they're completely unprepared for is what blindsides them.
Yeah.
And we're back to D&D and the Sinister Secret of Saltmarsh.
There you go. So I would be curious. The obstacles for me, if I were to run a game like that, and did in the 80s, was generating horror, because that would take real skill, like to actually make the players feel that at the table, and dealing with contemporary scenarios, contemporary world. So how do you guys handle that? Like, this modern world, everybody's going to have their own levels of expertise. I know, John, when we ran the game, you handled the 911 call, and it was like, that's not how 911 works, right? So how do you deal with the realities of the modern world and players who are going to know things that you don't?
Well, I tend to not run my games in the modern world. That's how I deal with it.
That's a good way to do
it. I run mine in like the 20s and 30s, but the few modern scenarios I have run, I did fight with modern technology a little bit. In fact, my way of dealing with it was to use it against the players, to build on the creep factor. It's like, yes, they have cell phones, and yes, they have laptops, and yes, there's the internet. But what happens when the old farmhouse ends up having a room full of internet that any nerd would just absolutely geek out over? That doesn't make sense. Why does it have this? Kind of. You can build on it. It's really easy to want to take things away, and the way the movies always handle it is they put them in the middle of nowhere.
Mm-hmm.
For whatever reason, cell service doesn't work, but you can only do that so many times before it becomes really contrived and boring, especially in in one shot this is not a big deal, but Sandy Peterson was big on in one of his talks on actually just using it against the players. They have the technology, so does the Cult of Dagon.
I think the thing for me in future is, if I do write my own adventure and it's a remotely modern one, is I'll set it in Britain, because I know British emergency.
Yeah.
I don't know anything. Yeah, I'll admit I don't know anything about American emergency services. So yeah, I may have screwed up that in that game.
It's just one example, though. I mean, like, there's so many things, like protocols, legal protocols. I would totally get lost, and my luck at it. Well, actually, I do. One of my D&D players, she's a lawyer. So if I were to play, introduce them to a game where there's any legal protocols, I can totally see her chiming in every 5 seconds. No, that's not how it works. That's not how it works.
Just run with it. Just run with it. Just
yeah. I mean, honestly,
let them drive it.
Any game, though, you're going to have that. You even in D&D, you could run into you're making claims about the wilderness, and somebody's like, "Well,
that's true.
Bears don't really do that."
but I my D&D default is on Earth. You would be correct. Yeah. We're not on Earth.
Yeah,
that ends the conversation right there. Yeah,
I think Call of Cthulhu is most of the time you are on Earth.
Yeah, that is a big problem. But I think it's like anything else, and because the same thing comes up when you're playing in other genres that are are heavily known, like running Star Wars and having somebody at the table going, "That's not what Jedi do," you know.
Yeah.
And you just have to kind of concede the point that, look, I'm not. If I was knowledgeable enough in everything to not make a mistake, I probably wouldn't have time to run a game for you. So
I think
back off.
the hiccup with the modern world is that we all live in the modern world. Like a fantasy world, you can bend reality,
Yeah.
and get away with it to an extent. In the modern world, you can break that immersion, which ties directly into the horror aspect. Which this is what I would always struggle with. I did as a kid, but I didn't know anything as a kid. But you know, because if you're playing a horror game, you want to at least unsettle your players in some time. And I think this would be one hell of a skill to be able to, you know, it's like campfire stories when you've got them wrapped and they're immersed. But how do you do it at a tabletop game?
I'm probably quite lazy when I do that because I tend to, if I feel I need to unsettle them, I just lean into the visceral stuff and just make something really disgusting.
Yeah. For me, I tend to do a slow trickle, like a kind of a creepy infusion of information over time, and let them wonder. So and I actually may even actually sort of cheap out on the visceral stuff. So, but yeah.
I guess the mystery would enhance that. I mean, you're investigating a mystery, so the unknown certainly helps. I would struggle with the horror element. I think it would bother me because I would want to get that right, but I know that's not necessarily a skill in my toolbox.
Well, for example, like my very first scenario I ran, and homebrew scenario took place in a cabin up in the mountains, and now it's a 1920s setting, but I think even in a modern setting, a cabin in the mountains is going to limit your level of technology. Anyways, the way I built the suspense and kind of the horror was, you know, they were isolated. The weather was not good, but also they would, you know, one night they just heard gunshots off in the woods. And then, like, the guy who owned the cabin, he's like, well, it's probably just the locals, you know, defending their stills, you know, whatever, you know, shooting at a varmint, whatever. And then one of the NPCs later on is out taking a bath because the cabin it was like more of a luxury cabin. The cabin had like a separate little bathhouse kind of thing with its own boiler. And she was out there, and somebody was walking around. She comes in and she's asking, you know, who was out there while I was taking my bath? Then somebody was walking around the bathhouse while she was bathing. None of the characters were, and the other NPC wasn't there. And so, of course, that just builds it. And then when they go hiking one day, they find a camp that shows a sign of a fight having happened there. You know, there are dead bodies. There have been guns fired. Nothing has been taken, though. So, you know, you can't write out, like, you know, you can't explain
Not
it
a
with
robbery, yeah.
robbery or even territorial disputes, or, you know, somebody's, you know, trying to, you know, knock off their still or whatever, because, you know, there's a perfectly good shotgun just laying on the ground, you know, who leaves a perfectly good shotgun behind. And so that those events happened over the course of several days. And then, of course, there was a lot of role playing here and there because, you know, it's like the whole thing was framed around visiting a friend for the holidays. So for like Christmas through to the New Year's, up at his new cabin that he had refurbished. And so, you know, and the scenario ended with them finding a dark hole in the woods that was basically some dug up old Indian burial mound, and having some horrible monstrosity come down their chimney and try and devour one of the NPCs. So, but, you know, it was a slow buildup like that can often really help build that sense of horror and terror. I mean, without necessarily having to get into the, you know, the rawr and the you know, and the gloopy drippy bits.
I mean, I think that's what sucked me in. The first adventure I ever played, it was the Cracked and Crooked Manse from the Mansions of Madness. There would be people who have played Call of Cthulhu who will know that adventure very well. And you are basically tasked to just check out an old house because a group of lawyers, estate agents, a group of lawyers operating for some estate agents want to try and sell it, and there are issues with its history, and you've just got to sort of make sure it's all okay, make sure that the make sure it'll be suitable for viewing, and if there's any aspects of that sort of history lying around, then just deal with them. But the problem is that here the history is a complete red herring. Red herring. But there is something horrible about the house.
Is kind of the haunting sort of uses that too. You're there under one auspice, and then it turns out that it's something, not to spoiler too much, but there's one published scenario for Call of Cthulhu that is a flat out Scooby-Doo, where you get there and everything seems like there's a paranormal, but it's basically Old Man Jenkins. It's just a normal explanation. I love it. I won't name the scenario because somebody might want to play it, but yeah, you get there and it's like at the end of it, you're like Old Man Jenkins, but and I would have got away with it too if it wasn't for you meddling investigators. But
Mark Hawkman says it's the sort of game where you might need to have characters pre-genned. Yes, yeah, certainly. If you're running the long campaigns, from what I've seen of the long campaigns, is they are suitably open in that you can bring in your own characters and they can develop with the campaign. But the keeper beforehand needs to explain the nature of the campaign beforehand and ensure the players create characters that fit. That it really is key. But for all the one shots, I would very happily just you give out a pre-gen. There you go. Have a pre-gen.
Yeah.
Play that pre-gen to the hilt. You can make amendments to it, but often with one shots, the pre-gens are tied into the campaign or tied into the adventure in some way.
Yeah, there's the pre-gens also. It's funny they rediscovered this with the Alien RPG with their cinematic play version. When you're doing pre-gens, you tend to run your characters a little bit more extreme, and you're not so much attached to their survival. And so you might play them more realistically, honestly, because you're going to take those risks. Yeah, so pre-gens are definitely good for one shots.
But this prevalence of one shots in Call of Cthulhu is probably why it has that reputation of being quite so lethal.
Very likely, yeah.
Because as you one shots are generally designed to be more lethal, and as you say, players will take more risks with them. So when I've run long campaigns, I've had very, very few character deaths. When I've run one shots, it's regularly been absolute carnage.
Yeah, I know. With my ongoing campaign at the table, we've had only one death, and that's because the character actually suicided himself to save the rest of the group. He didn't have to die. He could have tried to fight his way out, but instead he's like, no, go, I'll stay here. And really, the player just wanted a different character, but he at least went out in a dramatic way.
Yeah. One way of doing it. I mean, certainly. This Thursday, I'm hoping to start running one of the prequel campaign to Horror on the Orient Express that's set in Victorian era, and anyone who wants to join that will need to make a character that has a reason to be in contact with a certain person. It's up to the players to decide what that is. But it has to be there has to be a link between them and a certain professor. So you could have, for example, an academic that has met the professor on his various tours. You could have an adventurer who has accompanied the professor on one of his tours of strange burial sites or what have you. One of my players, one time I ran it, he made a street urchin who had attempted to rob the professor's house. The professor had caught him and taught him the right way about living.
There you go.
So
That's cool.
he brought him in as just sort of like almost a home help, and put him through an education. So we had that link there.
Yeah, with published scenarios though, if you are doing an ongoing campaign and you're bringing written stuff in or writing your own stuff, you do have that advantage of knowing who your characters are in the game. So you can if you're writing them, you can write them with hooks that make sense. If you're adapting, I've noticed that a lot of scenarios actually to have a section on using pre-existing characters and how to bring them in, which the better ones do at least. Like they'll usually have pre-gens, but they're like, if you're using your own characters, maybe they do this, that, and the other. So it might require a bit of a preamble, or maybe you have to have a scenario that you run to get them there. I know, actually it was really fun because Seth Krakowski inserted one scenario into the middle of another scenario he was running, like a whole other scenario into the middle of this longer scenario, and it worked perfectly. Of course, he's an experienced Call of Cthulhu GM, but and he's got a long-standing group of players. But a lot of times, you can just flex and adapt, and also making like you're talking about, talking to your players and making sure that they have reasons. Like all my players in my group, I'm like flat out, I'm like, how do you know each other? And oddly enough, it ended up being like, my wife's character owns this old brownstone that she inherited from her family. She's converted it into some boarding rooms, except for the upper floor where she lives, and the basement space, which used to be servants' quarters and a big old Victorian kitchen. One of the players rents one of the rooms from her, and then runs his little like paranormal rag newspaper out of her basement. Like, he's got his little office, like, he got kicked out of legitimate news work because he kept trying to write too many stories about the weird stuff that was going on in San Francisco. And the other two players at the time, one was a race car driver. I'm like, how do you know these people? And like, he's like, well, I know them through this mechanic who's the other player who does work on her car, on my wife's character's car. So they all knew each other those ways, but a lot of them also had we were doing the experience backgrounds. And so a bunch of them had selected the war vet because we're playing we're playing in like 1928. So, lots of great war veterans. And so my Jen's character was a war nurse, so she took the veteran package. The newspaper guy fought in the trenches, so he got the war veteran. He took the war veteran package. Another guy who started playing a doctor who didn't stay in the campaign long, but he's like, I was a doctor over there. And so, it just, they all had that. So we just kind of wove it together where they almost have this reason to be in the same proximity and have similar interests. Like Jen's character, reads tea leaves and tells fortunes in a back room in her brownstone. So just kind of, and he has a drop box for his newspaper where it's like, if you've seen something strange, and then for his contact, he's got a detective on the San Francisco Police Department who knows that there's stuff up, and he's kind of on the outs with the department, but he stays there doing his job and kind of feeds information. So we kind of set up this campaign setup where, at least locally, there's plenty of reasons. And then as the campaign's gone along, they've started to network with Arkham and everything like that. Cause we were playing on the West Coast. So.
And I mean, the other idea, running a campaign, one thing I do like about even with the published campaigns, is the fact that starting things gently and say, one of the points of this stream is to diffuse the idea that Cthulhu is instant insanity and death.
Yeah.
In a long running campaign, a lot of them are set up very nicely so that you might have a few early skirmishes, but they're quite low level. They might leave you with a few cuts and bruises or a minor gunshot wound that needs to be treated and ensuring scar. But what I tend to like from those long-term campaigns is a slow drip, drip, drip of sanity losses. A lot of the one shots have brutal sanity losses that characters have to react to, often with the player not having much to base that sanity loss on. But in a long running campaign, you can have a slow drip of experiences.
Yeah.
And
that
thus
build up. Yeah.
they build up and they build up and they build up, and they've got more to draw from when things do go horribly wrong, in terms of coming up with, okay, so what does go wrong in your mind? What now sets your mind off? Where does it go? Which particular instance is the one that you really get a flashback to, or an effect from, that sends you down whatever path you're going to go down.
Yeah,
well, in that game you ran for us, it's like it was every 5 minutes, make a sanity check, the forget-me-not scenario.
Yeah.
Right. And then I kept rolling so high. It was like 3 sanity checks and I was gone.
Yeah. That was part of the point of Forget-Me-Not, though. Is it is a fairly short, fairly intensive, extremely visceral, and it's almost like a shock Cthulhu scenario, in that it ramps up a lot of the things that we're told not to touch at modern gaming tables.
A lot of the modern scenarios set in the modern era do seem to touch on a lot of that. A lot of them are really leaning into things like child abduction, human trafficking, just like everything that's just cringeworthy about the modern world.
Yeah,
right. That is the modern horror. Yeah, I guess
Yeah.
the modern non-supernatural horror.
But I think the reason I like Forget-Me-Not so much is that the players start with nothing, and it does give you that drip of finding things out about why they're there, and there's a lot of freedom within it. It's a much more player-driven scenario than most Call of Cthulhu ones I've encountered, because the players can pretty much go anywhere within the town and try to solve things in whatever order they want to, or not solve things, as the case may be. It's got a lot more flexibility, but yes, it has got a lot of sanity checks, and there's a lot of very quick sanity loss in it, and it is absolutely brutal as far as that is concerned.
One thing that doesn't get talked about enough, I think, when it comes to the sanity mechanic, is that most scenarios and the core rules also include recovery of sanity.
Yes.
You generally speaking, after you beat a scenario, there is going to be a bullet point list of, if you accomplish this, gain back X. If you accomplish this, gain back Y. And there's ways to get better. Like, it might require parking your character for a while. Like Jen had to, park her mystic nurse character, as we jokingly call her, to play a different character for a while, because her mystic nurse is kind of on sabbatical trying to get better because her sanity was dipping way low. She's like, I should probably go before things get really bad. That's the sanity mechanic can be brutal, but there's also there are sanity recovery elements. Not to mention, some of the scenarios just are written with absolute craptastic sanity losses. I mean, I'm gonna invoke Seth Korkowski a lot, because he's kind of like one of the big names, talking heads for Call of Cthulhu right now. And he's actually, because of his videos, is why I got in, because he did his big 8-part series breaking down how the game works. And I watched it. I'm like, oh, okay.
Sean's character in Forget-Me-Not had a 1d20 sanity loss, and I rolled
a 20.
Well, and sometimes, though, you got to be careful with some of the written scenarios, because a lot of them are writing in sanity, because they're written for the one-shot tournament scene. Yeah. They've got sanity loss for dumb stuff. Like, one of the ones that I was going to say that I know Seth Korkowski covered is, you come into a dark room and see your reflection in the mirror. Roll sanity.
For sanity.
You drop a straight razor that you're handling. Oh no, roll for sanity. It was like, it's the 20s. every man has handled a straight razor, and probably most women, because safety razors are still not a thing. Really.
I could assure you the things that happened in Forget Me Not, though, were nothing like that.
I don't know, Eli. I dropped an egg while cooking the other day, and I fucking flipped out. So, I mean, the sanity loss is not entirely unrealistic.
But what's funny is in that same scenario, and this has got to be a writing error or bad editing, at the end of the scenario, when the big horrible thing shows up, it's like, meh.
yeah.
It's like,
well, you built up your resistance to insanity by dropping straight razors and looking in the mirror.
Another thing I like about the sanity mechanic that, of course, when everybody short forms it and goes, oh, it's all about going insane and getting killed, is that you can get used to things in the game as well. Like, if your character has a maximum sanity that they can take from something. Like, you encounter a bunch of ghouls and you max out the sanity you can suffer from ghouls for the rest of that scenario, and a few months afterwards, you're immune to the fear of the sanity loss caused by ghouls.
I only ever do a sanity loss if they encounter something nasty. It's only the first time they encounter it that really sets them going. They then harden up to it.
Yeah, and it's that stuff that doesn't get talked about that I think really damages the reputation of the game, because the game is not out there to get you. It's there still for you to play as a game and to enjoy.
Yes.
Is the thing. It's to enjoy in a certain way, but it's definitely not this, self-flagellation. I'm gonna play Call of Cthulhu.
Can I answer R.W. Bishop's question here? Is that close to Call of Cthulhu? It's more than close. It is Call of Cthulhu.
Oh yeah, every Call of Cthulhu is. I received a packet of papers from my late departed uncle. As I started reading through them, I started noticing something strange. Feeling like I needed to know more, I went out to my uncle's old mansion and monster.
Yes, absolutely.
Exactly, Call of Cthulhu. I mean, half the stories are like, my great uncle died. I must settle his affairs. I will be on the 4:15 train to blah blah blah. One chapter of train stuff, nightmare in the middle.
Get there. You go to the records office to find out a little bit about what your uncle experienced, and you might find that he encountered a young lady while on holiday in Brazil that gave him a mysterious egg. And very nice.
There's
never seen that
literally
egg.
A story where a guy finds out that his father screwed a white gorilla and created an entire subspecies. One of that is one of the Lovecraft stories. Because he was
now I have to roll for insanity trying to visualize that.
One of his big fears, Lovecraft, speaking of the author himself, was degenerate bloodlines. And so you've got that, and then the lurking fear, I think it is all about this inbred rich family in some mansion that now is a bunch of subterranean spookily doos who come out in the middle of the night.
Spookily doos, is that an official game term?
It should be. Mecca Studios. For majority of people I've spoken with about Call of Cthulhu, it seems GMs have leaned too heavily on insanity, making it. Yeah, exactly.
That's the reputation.
That is the reputation. It's insanity or death are the only real outcomes for your characters if you talk to way too many people. Fortunately, the internet has allowed us to hear other voices, but that was 100% the sum total of the reactions I ever got walking into your FLGS and talking to people about the game. Well,
that's why I like the drip of little things happening. So the players have got lots of things to pick up in terms of when it goes wrong sanity wise. They can pretty much choose how their character reacts, whether their character withdraws a little or has some irrational behavior, and they can slowly build it up themselves. I mean, I think that's the key with this insanity mechanic in a campaign, is let the players themselves buy into it and really play it up.
I love how the mechanic works, where you roll for a random response, or I mean, as a keeper, you can even make it situational. Like, often instead of rolling for a random thing, on the little low level, the bout of insanity thing that they talk about, I'll often have it be appropriate for the scenario. Oh, you cry out and make a noise, or you drop your flashlight. No, those are on the chart, but like I'm not gonna like you go blind for 5 minutes. It's like, especially if it was just a ghoul. I mean, a ghoul is still a humanoid creature. It's still roughly, it's not some unspeakable horror that's going to drive you mad. I mean, I might go blind if I ran into a ghoul in the wild. I don't know. Marhawk
it's more like you'd feel something warm dribbling down the inside of your leg on seeing this creature.
Yeah,
that's more likely what
I've been scared enough by stuff that I've run into in my life as it is to know that if I ran into something truly horrible, I used to actually joke when I was a kid. I'm like, I am simultaneously I want to find a werewolf in the woods and not find a werewolf in the woods because I would love the opportunity to know that such things are real, or even just a Bigfoot. Let's put even werewolves and horrible creatures. Like if I was to walk through the Pacific Northwest wilderness and see without a doubt a Sasquatch, I would be thrilled. I would probably pee myself, but I would be thrilled because I would have been able to see it. And I think that's kind of like that's the essence of Call of Cthulhu in a way. If you think about all horror RPGs, we all want to be at the table to play the game, to experience the horror. We have an idea how bad it could be. We're hoping it's not as bad as we're hoping it's not as bad as it absolutely could be. Somewhere in the middle is where we're hoping. But Marhawkwood's case here is exactly a good example of what was, being mentioned before with, I can't remember whose comment was. Oh yeah, it was R.W. Bishop's comment. This is a good example. Mob boss sending his henchmen to find out why somebody hasn't paid their debts. And monster. Well, the other thing too is the one thing that people forget about Lovecraft, and that is fun to do. And there's a whole other side to his writing that is the weird, like science fiction-y stuff too. And it's weird enough to where it still doesn't feel like science fiction, but it is. The Migo are little green men from another planet who come down and put your brain in a jar and have weird technology. There's the great race of Yith that time travels through sends their minds through space and time to inhabit the bodies of other people to experience that period of time. Meanwhile, that person's brain is sent back to the body of the Yithian in the year whatever thousand that they're in.
But look at the Mountains of Madness and the old civilization that is discovered in Antarctica. In that, that's
100% science fiction, but it's told in such a weird way that it still comes across as horrible. I mean, the Yithians. Like I had one scenario I ran where there was a guy who was running. It was because it's the 1920s when all these weird inventions are coming around anyways, right? People are figuring out radiation and electricity and stuff like that, right? And he had this box that was guaranteed to take your troubles away. And it was a piece of Migo technology that he had been tricked into manufacturing and mass producing and selling, that was basically stealing people's memories. They would sit there and they would sit in their room in their little sauna room or their little office, like listening to the little white noise out of this little silver box. Meanwhile, little pieces of their brain are being removed.
Lovely.
But and yeah, so I mean, there's that other side of Lovecraft's work and all of the other his. When you say Lovecraft's work, it's really him and everybody else, because so much of the game is built off of stuff that other people wrote and added in.
R.W. Bishop mentioned up thread that he doesn't read Lovecraft. He doesn't like Lovecraft as much as like Stephen King. Stephen King is the same thing, only with a contemporary style.
Yeah, and he's even said he's heavily influenced by Lovecraft.
By Lovecraft, yeah.
One thing I do want to say, so about the game itself, is in its biggest strength for me in terms of a system running this type of game is the simplicity of the game mechanic.
Oh yeah,
it is so fast, so simple, and the way that it ties in with you. I mean, you mentioned your wife's character getting better as in healing, not getting better in terms of being a hero, like in a fantasy game.
Yeah,
because the more you
she's
go
getting
on,
better, as in getting over her stuff.
Exactly. The peak physical and mental condition you will be in is when your character starts. You might get slightly better at certain skills, but all too often it has a cost. And it's a big balancing act. The mechanics balance it all out as it goes on and on. And it sort of charts a descent, whatever. And in terms of a campaign, it would be a much slower descent, as I've already mentioned, but it charts a descent, and the mechanics work in that sense. You're getting better at certain skills, but they cost you along the way.
Oh yeah, like as your mythos skill goes up, your max sanity goes down.
Yes.
And
the more you learn.
Although it's interesting, there's a weird point where you can actually become immune to the mythos as a whole, where like there's like when you reach a certain balance point. Even the sanity mechanic itself is kind of got some fun subtleties. Like when you fail a sanity check, you then have to try and see if you pass an intelligence check. So your dumb character might be better off because he's just too stupid to realize that what he ran into was truly horrific.
Because you don't want to pass that subsequent intelligence check, because that means you realize what's happened.
Some people are sick.
7th edition has introduced a lot of really nice refinements to the game. First of all, it got rid of the resistance table, which was one of the biggest, clunkiest elements of that system. I do like pushed rolls. I like the idea that pushed rolls, you fail the roll, you can choose to push it, but then the consequences are even worse if you fail. And there's a great example using Shadow over Innsmouth as an in-universe, in-book version of pushing a roll. It's where he goes to jump out the window of the hotel. If you've ever read the story, he's they're coming in his room and he looks out the window, and the way the example goes is like, so he goes to the window and in the story he realizes, it's too far for me to, it's too dangerous for me to go out. I could fall. That's him failing his climb check, right? But when they start bashing at the door and they're going to come through, he's like, I got to risk it anyways. It's like, so can I push the roll? And then the GM is like, or the keeper would be like, yes, but if you fail, you're going to break your leg. And so then he jumps out and he injures his leg and has to spend his night in the bog. That's an in-universe example of a good roll. The idea roll. I like the idea roll. Some people complain about the idea roll being a cheat, but Call of Cthulhu scenarios can be kind of nebulous, and it's easy to lose your way in them, and not like lose your way as in like your characters, just flat out the players at the table may forget something or may lose track of something, and that idea roll saying, okay, you're going to absolutely get a clue if you do this. The success fail on the roll is not yes or no, it's how bad it was getting that information. And the example that I heard used was, you're at the bookstore. Okay, we're going to do an idea roll. A good past idea roll would be recognizing that the shopkeeper is one of the faces you saw at the local cult rally, right? Okay, good. Now we know he's involved. A failed or poorly rolled, because there is no fail in an idea roll. A poorly rolled idea roll would be, you hear the door to the shop lock, see him flip the close sign, and then turn to face you holding a silver dagger. Oh, he's part of the cult, but there's a complication now.
Yes.
I love that idea roll. And like I said, they've refined it in 7th edition. They've refined it so much, because I have played Chaosium's earlier editions. I just haven't played Call of Cthulhu. I've played RuneQuest, and I played the old ElfQuest RPG, and I had Stormbringer and, and stuff like that. So, but
I mean, I like the addition of the luck mechanic. I've seen people complain about that, saying it makes scenarios easier, because every character starts with 3d6 times 5 luck points, and they can use them to modify rolls. Exactly. And the key there is what I like doing as a keeper is when somebody asks me, can I see something? Is there something here? And if it's not specified in the text, a lot of it will depend on the luck roll.
Yeah.
If they've just spent 20 points of their luck to succeed on a spot hidden check half an hour ago, and their luck has gone down from 50 to 30, when they're in this dark house asking me if there's a light switch, they've only got a 30% chance of there being a light switch in the house, whereas they had a 50% chance of it being there before.
Yeah, and the luck roll is also really useful for those situations where it's completely random who gets hit by something, and it's going to be the person with the lowest luck. Or, which member of the party does the ghoul attack when he jumps out of the sewer grate? Well, the guy with the lowest luck.
Guess who?
Yes.
And it's not being mean. It's just using the mechanic. The luck roll is also there for the players to use too, not just the keeper. It's like you can push a roll with it. Well, actually, interestingly enough, you can't use luck on a pushed roll. You can use luck to succeed in the first place, but you cannot use it on a pushed roll.
You can't use it on a sanity roll. You can use it in combat. You can use it on a skill check.
But once it's used, it's gone, and it's near impossible to regenerate. There are some edge case scenarios where you can get luck back. But also talking about like how getting better in the game is costly. All the tools that you're going to find to help you deal with the mythos come with a cost.
Just out of curiosity, sorry, on the luck issue, in a campaign play, can you not recover your luck? Because you'd figure you'd want, like, if that's permanently gone in a campaign, that could be problematic, right?
It depends on in pre-written campaigns, there's often a way of recovering luck, and it might just say, if they achieve such and such, then give them some luck points back. If I'm running an episodic campaign and there's been a 2 or 3 month gap between scenarios, I'll let people recover luck. It's up to the DM. It's up to the GM. Generally, in a single scenario, no. But in a campaign game, if you get some downtime, if you get a chance to chill out at a speakeasy and drink some illicit gin and smoke some good cigars, then you're feeling good. So you'll get a bit of your luck back.
To me, that would have tied in with the sanity, like you were saying in the campaign. You got to be able to recover this stuff.
Yes.
So I'd imagine that luck. Otherwise, it's like, okay, we've played 3 sessions. I have no more luck. I guess I'm going to die now.
I wouldn't necessarily let them recover all their luck, but there'd be a percentage that come back.
Now you've got me diving into the rule book here real quick. But
then I have done my job.
Although I will say one possible minor complaint about the Call of Cthulhu game is that the 7th edition rulebook is not formatted the best. It can
they
be
never
a
have
hard,
been.
It can be a little hard to find stuff in there. It's like you really are dealing with a mythos tome here.
Is it bound in human flesh? Because that would explain it.
I don't know. Spending luck, recovering luck points. Okay. All right, so the official on this is after each session of play, each player may make an improvement check for their luck. This is rolled in the same way as a skill improvement. Player rolls D100. If the roll is above their present luck, then they can get it back. So, yeah.
That's not too unreasonable.
Yeah.
If your luck is super low, your odds are you're going to get some back. But if you're high up there, then, less chance.
It's 1d10. It's 1d10. Yeah. It's 1d10. So that's not as bad as I thought it was. It does dwindle away, and you're not always guaranteed to get it back. But so cool. So
right.
We've talked about our experiences with the game and stuff. Have you had? Are there any particular problems you've had with the game, either players or running it as a GM, or even the product range, the community? I don't know.
The biggest, there were 2 main issues I have. One is you've got to play with the right group. if you play with a group who are fresh from D&D, or are meeting up for takeaway and beer on a Friday night after a long week at work, they're going to struggle to have the mindset for a game of Call of Cthulhu, because you've got to have a group who are quite respectful, who will concentrate, who will listen with minimal background disturbances. Whereas if you're just used to a game of D&D on a Friday night where there's people are throwing flicking drinks at each other and dice are bouncing off the table and the dog's barking and whatever, Call of Cthulhu might not be the right game for that sort of scenario. In fact, it certainly isn't, because that kills any atmosphere. The other thing is, I've used a lot of the published stuff. It takes time to become confident enough, for me certainly, to get to grips with the idea of players going very much off scenario. And there are quite a lot of the published scenarios are very linear.
Yeah.
And it takes practice. It takes combination of practice and having a relaxed attitude to running the game, and that comes with practice. So there are some scenarios that I have found awkward to run at times because of their linear nature. And I look back now, some of these I ran 3 or 4 years ago. If I ran them now, I'd run them a lot better.
Yeah.
But obviously, there's a learning process involved.
Yeah. The biggest problem I have had, and this is very, very rarely has it come up, but so I guess it's not a huge problem, but the biggest issue I've had in playing the game is players being willing to get dangerous. Often spending way too much time wanting to research and reconnoiter before they take action.
I don't have a problem with that.
Well, I don't either, except for when we're going on to the 3rd session of them interviewing people and checking out local libraries and records and stuff. Then it becomes a bit of a problem. But that's not a huge problem. It is one of the biggest problems I've had. Community-wise, the community is great. Though I have noticed, at least in interacting with the community at large, anytime you present a really cool idea, like I'll go on to, there's a gigantic Call of Cthulhu players group on Facebook. It's a really good group. But anytime you mention a scenario on there, the first response from anyone is, you should write that up and publish it. Like, maybe I'm just here wanting to talk about my scenario idea with other like-minded players. That, and also there is so much out there.
Yeah.
And it is hard to know a lot of times if somebody's already written something, or often, has there a scenario been, has anybody ever written a scenario that deals with this subject matter? And then it'll be like, either I'll get one of 2 answers. Yes, this module, or you should write that up. But I guess that's, there are worse things to have than an overly helpful and enthusiastic community. But yeah, I mean, when you're going out to the community and like the first thing anybody wants you to do is write it up so they can consume it, they're hungry for scenarios, and there's a lot out there, and it's hard to find. It's hard to find like the scenario that does the thing that you want to do. It's one of the reasons I think I homebrew a lot, because like I can just make a scenario that does whatever I want to do. But at the same time, I find myself wondering, I'm like, is there another scenario elsewhere that's already been written that I don't have to put the work in for?
It's funny you mentioned players not engaging, always playing it safe and taking the time to research. My mind goes to D&D, where it's the opposite problem. They don't do enough time consulting sages and researching what they're getting into. They just launch in and try to kill everything and get butchered. But that's a bad thing in D&D, whereas you launch in and get butchered in Call of Cthulhu, that's part of the fun.
Well, the problem with the Call of Cthulhu is that is a sure way to get yourself killed. Yes. The game is not friendly to people who want to fight. And the thing to remember also that you have to remember is like, okay, if you're going against cultists, people are like, well, cultists are just humans. Yes, and it's the 20s or the 30s or even modern day. They have the same access to firearms, maybe
That
even
you do,
better,
yeah.
maybe even better that your
And
character
your
does.
characters are just humans as well. So
Yeah,
straight fight with cultists. It's 50-50. There you go.
Like if your investigator team is an academic, a writer and a historian, and then you run into a cult, who's going to have the better access to illicit weapons and underground access to things?
Even if the cultists are all academics and writers, there's still more of them than you.
Well, and the fact of the matter is they're also going to still be more connected, and they're going to have their, it's like and guns in the game will take you out fast.
Right.
It's like there's
As
none of
they
this.
should.
Yeah, and that's the thing. You are not bulletproof. Even if you can get yourself body armor, you're still not bulletproof. And the monsters generally are way more resistant to damage, even firearms and stuff. There's a reason why the joke in Call of Cthulhu is basically a stick of dynamite or a can of gasoline is your best friend. Because you can most things can be blown up,
yeah,
or burned. But even a lot of those things, they're if you blow them up, they're only stopped temporarily, and they'll reform. Or
one thing I do like about, so many of the Call of Cthulhu scenarios are written with a clever way of killing the boss, the monster. And that's usually the purpose of the adventure. You investigate, you find something horrible is happening, you find things around the house which are clues, or things going on that are clues, but often buried in there is something giving you an idea as to what the entity's weakness is.
Yeah,
and that's usually the purpose of that one shot, is to find out what the weakness of that entity is and how to get past it.
Yeah, like in the crooked and cracked manse or whatever it is, the one you were talking about, the one mansion of madness is like salt.
Yes. It's salt.
But and then I know, like, the one thing that I think in an ongoing campaign, at least, that one problem I've had with players is wanting to. So in D&D, for example, you go through a dungeon and you either beat the dungeon or you don't, generally, right? You go through it, you get the treasure, you kill the monster. In Call of Cthulhu, sometimes your best victory option is just enough. Or
yes.
And getting players to accept that just enough, or we've managed to stay the execution of all of mankind for another 100 years is the end that they need to be happy with. There's this instinct for players to want to keep following up and keep trying to figure out how do we destroy the thing. No, maybe just a lot of times destruction isn't an option. Sometimes it's just stopping the ritual, or
delaying,
buying
time,
or getting out alive enough to tell the authorities so they can come in and bomb Innsmouth. Basically, because that's what happened in Shadow over Innsmouth. They got wise to the town. They came in and they torpedoed the reef, and the army attacked the town. And but
and the protagonist of the story returns and realizes he's one of them.
Exactly. But although it's funny, not all the entities and bad guys in Call of Cthulhu are necessarily horrible, bulletproof, unkillable things. Because if you remember, like, Wilbur Whately gets killed by a guard dog in Dunwich Horror. He's the son of Yog-Sothoth, and he gets killed by a dog.
Dog's a man's best friend for a reason.
But no, so I mean, I think that's when players are going through Call of Cthulhu, it's really easy for them to either feel like they're too vulnerable or still feel like they're invulnerable, and you can play off of that as well. Like
I mean, certainly when I first ran it, my group played it believing they were pretty much invulnerable. I ran the Haunting, which they got through all right. So I threw them straight into a Gaslight scenario called From the Sacraments of Evil book, and it was absolute carnage. As you said, they just had completely the wrong idea of what they were meant to, how they're meant to deal with things, and they didn't even get close to dealing with the whatever the cult was up to. I can't remember many of the details of the scenario, but it was just savage. They were just reduced to crying heaps in the corner. They were shot to bits. They were stabbed with swords, all sorts, and then it just ended in a total bloodbath.
Yeah,
Total bloodbath.
Mechhead Studios question here. The starter set for Call of Cthulhu is actually worth getting unless you're absolutely committed to being all in. The starter set's a really good one to go with. It's funny because the Carnage thing that you're talking about, it's like it's hard to control, especially playing in the 20s. It's hard to control the access to firearms for your players because they can literally order a Tommy gun through the mail. Because in 1920s America, before the 30s, when we had the Firearms Act, you could order basically anything through a catalog.
Well, what helped with this one is it was London. So I mean, London in the 1920s you could, but they 1890s actually, 1890s, so it would have been easier, but the quality of the firearms would have been worse.
Yeah.
But no, here's the starter set. You get a choose your own adventure, Alone Against the Flames. Shilling for my own channel there because we've played through it a few times on that. It's quite good. It's a little bit derivative, and after about an hour in, I can guarantee you'll work out which film was the inspiration for it. If I was to say Edward Woodward and Christopher Lee, 1970s, there you go.
The old Wicker Man.
The introductory rule book is how many pages? 24 pages. That's all it is. Introductory rules. That is everything you need to play the basic game. And you also get a book with a number of very simple introductory scenarios. There's 3 scenarios in there. Very, very simple paper chase. Very, very lightweight, not remotely scary type adventure, but it is a good beginning adventure. Edge of Darkness is a really good second one. It ramps it up a lot more. And I've not read Dead Man's Stomp, the third one. But again, so for your money, you get a rule book, 3 adventures, a choose your own adventure. You get a set of dice, which I've not even opened. And big book of handouts and maps. It's really, really good. Really, really good for the money. You've got probably 6 good gaming sessions in there, plus however long times you want to play Alone Against the Flames. General Nut, you didn't. I'm sure you took part in that stream when I ran it.
That's awesome. So, Jason, I know outside of Streamland, so I've been talking to him a little bit about his trouble in getting games going with his local group. So it's kind of cool to see him jumping onto this one. So let's see. I think we've covered all the main points. Anything else we didn't cover, or maybe it's time to field questions from the chat if they've got any specifics.
I've probably got at most about 10 minutes left before I've got to go make dinner.
Because, we're at the hour and a half mark, so if we can close it up in the next half hour, great. Other than that, really, I guess if I had to say anything in sum, Call of Cthulhu is a great game. It's got a lot of breadth in the type of stories and scenarios you can tell. Like I was mentioning, you could do visceral horror, you can do slasher stuff if you want, you can do creepy mystery stuff, you can do mysteries that don't have a single paranormal element in them because they may just all be about going after a book and dealing with a cult.
Or horrible people.
Yeah, horrible people.
Did you ever watch the show Torchwood?
Yes.
There's that great episode in the first season, Countryside, which they're investigating, disappearance of these villagers, and the big twist in the end is that the villagers, spoiler, the villagers were behind everything. They were just a big cult of cannibals. It was fantastic. One of the better episodes.
Yeah, and I mean, to that end, there are actually I think there's 2 volumes from I can't remember which edition, called Blood Brothers, for Call of Cthulhu, and Blood Brothers were non-Lovecraftian characters, monsters, scenarios written up as short Call of Cthulhu stories. One is a chainsaw wielding loony at a sleepover camp. One is basically Frankenstein. They've got all these. So the game can handle everything. The main rulebook even acknowledges that by having mundane monsters like zombies and vampires and werewolves in there, because it doesn't always have to be Lovecraft. And that's actually kind of, I think, one of the ways you can keep the Lovecraft stuff fresh is like sometimes it's just a ghost. Just a ghost. But of course, in Lovecraft versions, ghosts are often men trapped out of time, appearing to us through the veil between dimensions.
Yep. I've run an adventure where that's happened.
Exactly. I mean, Dreams in a Witch House. That's kind of what's going on. Is the witch is literally using math to try to time travel, because Lovecraft was terrified of math. Was it one? The quote did not have the constitution for mathematics.
I feel that remark.
But it's hilarious because on a total rant, if you look at all of this stuff, all of his horror stories, all of his writing is basically him writing about things that he was afraid of and didn't understand. Like the if you ever read the story, Cool Air.
No, I've not read that one.
No.
Imagine him writing a horror story about longevity and forced longevity and immortality through refrigeration the same year that the air conditioner was invented.
Well, I think you've just ruined all of Lovecraft for me, because now every time he writes about somebody seeing a horror and going insane, I'm just going to imagine equations on a blackboard in math class.
It's funny because it is, the more you read about him, and if you actually read any of the stuff written on him, it becomes very apparent that, like, all of his weird, like, fish frog things, it's like
just personal phobias.
He grew up in Rhode Island and probably saw beaches littered with dead things all the time that were washed up from the ocean or in the fish markets and stuff like that. But no, but the game is good. It runs really well, especially the 7th edition with its mechanics. It's not as lethal as everybody is going to make it out to be. It can be, but that's not the purpose of the game. The game is really great for storytelling and really challenging players to investigate and deal with problems in ways that they don't deal with them in other RPGs. And in a way, in a set of mechanics that's built for that. I mean, you can do investigations in D&D, but the game system really isn't built for that. I don't think the game itself doesn't help you at all in doing the investigation. That's all on the players in D&D.
Yeah.
But Call of Cthulhu is it. Had I discovered it earlier and started playing it earlier, it probably would be my number 1 game. I actually enjoy running it more than I enjoy running D&D these days.
Same.
Yeah, it is very much a game I want to play more of.
I don't know why I hang out with you guys.
Keeping us honest. But
I think the thing with me is because I've almost always used Call of Cthulhu as like a backup sort of game. It's stayed very fresh for me, and having that freshness there, and I get excited about running it. It's something that I'm not going to say D&D becomes mundane. It becomes normal. It becomes the normal one. But it's Call of Cthulhu is something different, and I always look forward to that something different. weirdest weakness we've seen on a bad guy in a Call of Cthulhu game. I'm gonna have to. I've already mentioned it. That one with salt.
Yeah, that's. I mean, I haven't even written any that have weirder weaknesses. So, that's of all of the ones I know of, that's the weird one. So,
Yes. Yeah.
Let's see. Not sure what he means by cover more sanity. You want to talk about it more, or?
The way, I mean, the way I've got my players to deal with sanity, certainly in a longer campaign, is as I mentioned earlier, the idea of them coming up with little triggers, things that set them off, and behavior patterns. I had a priest. I've mentioned on this on multiple my own streams. A priest who decided that degeneracy and prostitution was what was at the root of all evil in the world. So whenever they arrived in any new city while crossing Europe on the Orient Express, he'd spend his first night in the local jail because he'd be arrested for harassing women down the red light district, shouting, screaming at them. First thing he'd do, he got off the train, he'd say, well, where's the red light district? I must try and expel this degeneracy from the world. And he'd be there going, you foul women of the night.
I also think it's important to understand that the sanity mechanics in Call of Cthulhu are not meant to replicate real world insanity or actual insanity. They're designed to replicate the way sanity is handled in the stories. As I descended deeper and deeper into the lore of such and such, my mind started to slip into fits of anguish and blah blah blah. I mean, the story Dagon has a guy writing from a room, recounting his encounter with Dagon on a mysterious island in the Pacific. He's back home safe and sound, but he's only been kept sane by the use of narcotics, and he's run out. The only problem I ever had with that story is it's written by him as it's happening, the final moments, and so he's like, the window, I must get to it. Like, you literally sat at your table and wrote the window, I must get to the window.
Yeah.
before you jump out of the window. But so I mean, the madness in the game is not real world insanity. It is insanity as it appears in the stories.
It's heightened narrative insanity as opposed to, well, I mean, there's nothing saying you can't infuse real world, notions, the schizophrenia or whatever. You got to be careful about triggering your players potentially, but
that's true. It is definitely one of those games where it pays to know your players' limitations. And when introducing new players to the game, I will often ask where their bar is. Like, I have a new player who's going to be playing with me, and she does not watch horror movies, but she has no problem reading or hearing descriptions of horrific things. She can't see them. Marhawkwood, yeah, that's correct. There's a comment in here about that's actually it doesn't divide the rules into two books. It's got a main rule book that has everything you need to play, and then a supplemental bunch of content for the players that can expand on the options for the players. So it's I don't feel like it's bad at all. It's definitely worth having the player's book or the investigator's handbook, but it's not necessary to play the game. We're just going to kind of go through and find the last ones here. We already did the weirdest weakness. Keeper's Deck. I'm not even familiar with that as a product. I mean, I've not seen it. I think it's just a bunch of handy, sanity. I think the Keeper's Deck has sanity cards, for handing out to people and stuff like that. Isn't it? Are you familiar with that at all, John?
No, I've never used it. Never used it. So.
Yeah, I wouldn't say it's needed. I think it's a bunch of shorthand stuff, you have fishophobia, whatever. Yeah. Here's what the card says about it. But yeah, I think we've kind of nailed it I mean, unless anybody has some specific questions, it is one of those games that can take you so many different places, and you can do so many different things. And depending on your setting, it presents different challenges, whether it's modern or a historical setting. I mean, there are even been scenarios that have been written in futuristic settings for Call of Cthulhu, like science fiction meets Call of Cthulhu. So it can definitely
dreamlands and all that sort of stuff.
Oh, that's the other thing, dude. We didn't even mention. This is the whole other aspect, because they've incorporated the dreamlands into the mythos for the game. You want to go on a fantasy romp a la D&D? Have your players end up in the dreamlands, because it's literally a fantasy realm. So it's got horrible Lovecraftian monsters in it, but
that's okay. So does D&D.
Yeah, exactly. But I think on that note, we're going to call the stream to a close. I'm going to thank everybody who showed up in the chat today. John, thank you for joining. You can catch John on his own channel at Ye Olde Geek. Mage's Musings is the resident puppet wizard on his channel.
The D&D focus guy. I just came in to be the noob on the Call of Cthulhu stream.
Yeah. John does a lot of game reviews, module reviews, does some cool read-throughs for fighting fantasy books, polls, opinion pieces occasionally.
I just do whatever takes my fancy on a Monday or Tuesday when I wake up.
Yeah. Mage's channel is really good because he also does review caps, which are wonderful ways of presenting the modules in both a review and recap of his campaign. And he's started doing some really useful shorts on specific rules and key points for AD&D and OSE/BX.
Let me tell you, trying to cram them into 1 minute is getting more and more challenging.
Yeah, but no, and if you like puppets, it's another thing too, because the whole channel is presented through 2 puppets. So
yes,
let's see. Out of the folks in the chat, GM's Alcove, he has a good channel, so definitely check him out for painting hangouts. And Mechhead Studios, he does just general hobby stuff with the occasional opinion piece as well. So, anything else from you two folks?
No, it's dinner time for me, because it's
lunchtime for me.
Yeah,
it's 5:42 in the evening here, so early evening.
All right. Well,
just a little preview. Elfbait several months ago donated a little mini scenario to my campaign. It's going to start making its little teaser appearance in my upcoming review cap.
Awesome.
Finally got there. So
cool. I can't wait to see it come out on your channel and see what the wizard has to say about it. All right, guys. Well, everybody have a great day. I'm going to go actually make myself some lunch and get out and game if you can.
Have a good day, everyone.
Later, folks.
Cheers all.